In 1947, Rio de Janeiro still carried the air of a city in the bloom of expansion. Trams rattled through the streets and vendors called out to customers in the bustling Largo de Carioca. It was into this scene that the Nunes family disembarked at the port, after a long journey that had begun weeks earlier in the interior of Bahia. João Nunes, a 42-year-old farmer, had decided that before his children grew too old, he would take them on their first and only family vacation. Maria, his wife, had agreed without hesitation, even though the expense was a great strain on their modest means. Their journey had started in a freight truck, rattling from their small town in the Bahian backcountry to the coastal city of Salvador. From there, they boarded a vessel that carried both passengers and cargo. After days sailing along the coast, it finally docked in Rio. For 10-year-old Lúcia and 7-year-old Pedro, everything was a marvel. The briny scent of the sea, the gulls that swooped and cried near the ship, the intense, chaotic energy of the docks. In the children's eyes, a mixture of weariness and wonder told the story of a once-in-a-lifetime experience. The main purpose of their trip was to see Christ the Redeemer, a national symbol since its inauguration in 1931. Back in Bahia, João had spoken of the monument with such pride to his neighbors that it was as if this visit were a personal pilgrimage. On the morning of June 15, 1947, the family awoke early in their room at the Pensão Simples, a humble guest house in the Catete neighborhood. They put on the best clothes they had brought. João wore a freshly ironed white shirt and light-colored trousers. Maria, a patterned dress. Lúcia was dressed in a floral frock with white socks, and Pedro in a button-down shirt and starched shorts. A brown canvas backpack, a gift from a close friend, was packed with a little water, some fruit, and a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. The path to Corcovado involved a tram, a short walk, and then the funicular that climbed the mountainside. João, however, wanted them to walk a portion of the trail on foot, to truly feel the place. So they took the stone path, flanked in some parts by dense vegetation and in others by breathtaking views of the city below. High above, the Christ statue appeared, still distant but already magnificent. The day was overcast, and a slow-moving mist drifted across the mountain, at times concealing the statue, at others revealing it. It was at one of these clearings that a street photographer, noticing the well-dressed family, offered to capture the moment. The image, which decades later would become the most recognized portrait of the case, showed João with his arm resting gently on Maria's shoulder, the children standing side by side, and the canvas backpack at their father's feet. In the background, Christ the Redeemer emerged from the clouds, and the uneven stone path reinforced the rustic nature of their ascent. In that instant, nothing suggested it would be one of the last recorded moments of the family together. They continued their walk, ascending calmly, pausing to admire the scenery and to let Lúcia and Pedro rest. Other tourists and local guides saw them pass. Years later, some would recall the family's tranquility, their unhurried pace with no signs of distress. They looked like any other family on a day out. Near a marker labeled Zungal A30, they approached a higher lookout point where the view of Guanabara Bay was nearly complete. The area was not crowded, and the murmur of conversation was a mix of accents from all over Brazil. João shrugged the backpack from his shoulder, set it on a low stone wall, and offered fruit to his children. Pedro became fascinated by a hummingbird darting among nearby flowers, while Lúcia grew impatient, eager to reach the top. And then, shortly after noon, something shifted. Not because of a noise or a commotion or any confusion, but because of their absence. Witnesses who had seen them just minutes before could not recall seeing them descend. No guide was with them, and there was no record of them boarding the funicular. It was as if, upon rounding a bend in the trail, the family had simply ceased to exist in that space. When other visitors noticed their prolonged absence, they assumed the family was merely resting somewhere further along the path. But by late afternoon it was clear they had not returned, nor had they passed by the trail's entrance. A veteran guide would later remark on a strange feeling that lingered. It was, he said, as if they had evaporated into the mist. The first searches began that same evening, but the fog thickened as the light faded. Rescuers walked the trail from top to bottom, calling their names into the gloom, but only silence answered. The atmosphere of pleasant tourism gave way to an unsettling quiet. High above, the Christ statue watched over the city, its stone eyes the silent keepers of a mystery that would endure for decades. Night fell on Corcovado with a cold wind slicing across the mountainside. The search for the Nunes family had escalated from simple concern to a full-blown alert. João, Maria, Lúcia and Pedro had not returned to their guest house, and no one could pinpoint the exact spot where they were last seen disturbingly. All anyone knew was that they were on the trail around noon. And after that, nothing. The first makeshift search party consisted of 3 experienced local guides, a funicular maintenance worker and 2 guards. They moved up and down the trail with heavy, weak-beamed lanterns that illuminated little more than a small circle of stones at their feet. The only sounds were the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and the distant drone of cicadas. In places, the scent of damp earth mingled with that of crushed plants, a possible sign of passage, but nothing was conclusive. Meanwhile, back in Catete, the owner of the guest house, a Portuguese widow who rented cheap rooms to travelers, waited anxiously. She had taken a liking to the couple and their children. Around 9 o'clock, she sent a young man she knew to the nearby tram station to ask if anyone had seen the family from Bahia. The answer was no. The boy returned with the news that no group matching their description had come down from Corcovado that day. At dawn on June 16th, the effort intensified. Teams took turns ascending and descending, examining every crevice between the rocks, every curve in the path. João had been carrying the brown canvas backpack when he was last seen, but it, too, was nowhere to be found. This detail began to trouble the searchers. If they had gotten lost or fallen, surely some of their belongings would have been found along the way. On the second day, the search perimeter was expanded to the dense forest bordering the main trail. The progress was slow and difficult. The vegetation was thick, the terrain uneven and littered with moss-covered boulders. The sound of their own footsteps breaking dry twigs was muffled by the sheer density of the trees. Every so often, a guide would stop, raise a hand for silence, and call out the family's names. The wind carried their voices away, but brought no answer. The story began to appear in local newspapers. Small articles mentioned the disappearance, highlighting the unusual nature of 4 people vanishing together in a popular tourist area. Reporters tried to photograph the location, but the frequent fog obscured any clear shots. Some sensational headlines hinted at the possibility of an intentional flight, but there was no evidence to support such claims. As the days turned into a week, the complete lack of clues left everyone perplexed. The only solid record was the photograph taken by the street photographer, showing a complete, orderly family, their clothes clean, their expressions calm. It was difficult to reconcile that image with their sudden disappearance. Even the oldest guides could not recall anything like it. After the first week, the official search was scaled back. Still, some local residents and guides persisted on their own, combing less likely areas, like the entrances to drainage tunnels and small caves formed by clusters of rock. They found remnants of old campfires and time-worn scraps of paper, but nothing that could be linked to the Nunes family. The case grew quiet, and slowly the story transformed into the kind of rumor told to lingering tourists, a ghost story for the mountain. Back in Bahia, the news arrived late, delivered by telegrams and letters. The few close relatives they had were left devastated. There were no bodies, no news, only a void impossible to fill. Maria's younger sister spent years pleading with authorities to reopen the search, but without new leads, nothing was done. Decades later, when the story seemed buried in collective memory, that photograph from 1947 began to circulate again. Reproduced in books and articles about unsolved mysteries, the image of the backpack at João's feet would become central to the case's reopening. But that would only happen much later, when an unexpected find would once again put the Nunes family's name in the newspapers. Before 1998, however, there were only scattered memories, yellowed clippings, and the unsettling feeling that something did not add up. Corcovado continued to receive visitors from all over Brazil. The Christ statue continued to watch over the city from on high, and somewhere on that mountainside, the fate of 4 people remained a secret, untouched, as if time itself had conspired to preserve the mystery. Looking at the old photograph today, one might notice small details that seemed irrelevant at the time. The placement of the backpack, the posture of the children, João's serious expression, perhaps more tense than usual. It is impossible to know if something was already unfolding behind that facade of normality. But with the discovery that would come more than half a century later, these elements would be seen in a new light, not as answers but as the seeds of even more difficult questions. The passage of years did not erase the disappearance of the Nunes family, but it transformed the event into something that survived more in oral tradition than in official records. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, a few Corcovado guides still spoke of the Bahian family, but with no new developments, the story gradually faded. Tourists ascended and descended the trail every day, largely unaware that on that very path, an entire family had been seen for the last time. Rio itself changed dramatically during that period. The streets filled with cars, the trams began to disappear, and the city sprawled north and west. Modernization brought new buildings and avenues. Christ the Redeemer, however, remained a steadfast witness to the transformation below. Visitors continued to be enchanted by the view, by the distant sea, by the feeling of standing before a national icon. But for a few veteran guides, a shadow of memory would always fall across certain points on the trail. In Bahia, the silent grief of the family left behind never faded. Maria's sister, who was only 21 at the time, became the primary guardian of the memory of her sister, her brother-in-law, and her niece and nephew. She kept the letter Maria had sent just days before the trip, describing her excitement about seeing Rio. She also kept newspaper clippings about the disappearance, folded and stored in a wooden box. Over time, the paper yellowed and the ink began to fade, but to her they were proof that the story was real. Among the few preserved records was the famous photograph taken on the trail. The street photographer who took it, a man named Antonio Vieira, continued to work in the area until the early 1960s. In later interviews, he claimed to remember the Nunes family clearly. "Polite, simple people," he would say. The girl smiled easily, the boy seemed more serious, the father didn't say much, but he thanked me for the picture. Antonio could not recall seeing anything strange that morning, which only deepened the enigma. Over the following decades, all sorts of hypotheses emerged, but none were ever supported by evidence. Some said the family must have taken a wrong turn, gotten lost, and fallen in a remote, inaccessible spot. Others suggested they could have been victims of a crime, but with no witnesses or traces, the idea remained pure speculation. In time, the case was officially closed, and the original files were stored away in a central police archive, where they likely remained untouched for decades. Until 1998. An unexpected event was about to change the course of this long-dormant story. Corcovado was undergoing structural renovations. The access walkway to the main viewpoint needed reinforcement, and teams of workers, along with experienced guides, were helping to transport materials and survey more remote areas. It was during one of these inspections that two guides and a construction worker decided to check a rocky section to the side of the main path, partially hidden by roots and dry leaves. The spot was several meters off the trail and not easily accessible. The boulders were large, covered in moss and lichen, and between them were narrow crevices filled with accumulated branches and earth. As they cleared away some of the vegetation, one of the guides noticed a piece of light-colored fabric, grimy with age, wedged between two rocks. At first, they thought it was just old trash, but as they pulled at it carefully, they realized there was more. It was a canvas backpack with leather straps, remarkably similar to the old model the older guides remembered from the 1947 photograph. The backpack was partially buried, as if it had been placed there intentionally and then slowly covered by natural debris over the years. Beside it lay a man's dark leather shoe, still intact despite the dampness. Entangled in the fabric were dark stains that could have been rust or something else entirely. An immediate silence fell over the three men. One of them spoke, almost in a whisper, that the backpack looked just like the one from the story of the Bahia family. Park protocol was clear. Any object found in a restricted area had to be reported to the administration. Word of the find quickly spread, reaching a veteran employee who knew the local legends. He insisted that nothing be touched until the police arrived. As they waited, the three men stared at the discovery, a strange mix of curiosity and unease settling over them. They didn't know if they were looking at a mere coincidence or a pivotal clue in a mystery half a century old. When the forensics team arrived, they cordoned off the area and began their work. The jagged rocks made access difficult, and they had to use tools to widen the crevice and extract the contents without causing further damage. The backpack, heavy with moisture, was carefully placed into a large plastic bag. Inside, along with the shoe, were clothes balled up and tattered by time. Dark stains on one of the garments immediately drew their attention. Everything was sealed and taken away for analysis. Days later, the visual confirmation was undeniable. The backpack and the shoe were identical to those in the 1947 photograph. The pattern of the stitching, the type of canvas, the leather on the straps, it all matched. But the absence of bones or any human remains dashed any hopes of an immediate resolution. Still, for many, this was the first concrete clue in over 50 years, and it reignited questions that had long seemed forgotten. The news of the discovery raced through the press. Newspapers published images of the backpack alongside the old family photograph, and the case was officially reopened. But as had happened so many times before, the answers did not come as quickly as the questions. What was the backpack doing there? How had it ended up in such an isolated and inaccessible spot? And most importantly, where were João, Maria, Lúcia and Pedro? The impact of the 1998 discovery was immediate, both for those involved in the park's renovation and for the few who still remembered the case. The reappearance of the brown canvas backpack, so clearly visible in the 1947 photo, stirred memories that had lain dormant for decades. For the older guides, it was as if the past had suddenly broken through into the present, and not gently. The general feeling was that something important was about to be revealed, but what emerged was a set of even more disturbing questions. The items were taken to the Forensic Medical Institute, where specialists examined every detail. Time had been cruel. The backpack's canvas was covered in irregular dark stains. Its seams were weakened and the leather straps had hardened. The man's dark leather shoe was surprisingly well preserved, perhaps protected by the position in which it was found. Inside there was only compacted earth and fragments of dried leaves. No trace of human or animal tissue. The clothes, however, were of greater interest. They were simple garments consistent with the era: a light, thin fabric shirt, a patterned cotton skirt, and a larger piece of cloth that could have been used as an improvised sheet or towel. The shirt had brown stains concentrated on the front in an irregular pattern. At first, some suspected rust, but the coloration suggested another possibility, and samples were sent for analysis. Yet moisture and time had degraded any biological trace that might have been identified with certainty. As the forensic work continued, reporters began to make their way up Corcovado, hoping to get images of the site. Access was restricted, however, requiring them to navigate steep and unstable terrain. Nevertheless, photographs of the find, especially one showing the backpack wedged between moss-covered rocks next to the shoe and the stained fabric, were published in newspapers and broadcast on news channels across the country. The image, placed side by side with the photo of the Nunes family, created a painful contrast, the before and after of a mystery that had endured for more than 5 decades. The reopening of the case brought old documents to light. In the Central Police Archive, the 1947 file was pulled from a dusty shelf, its paper edges brittle. Inside were testimonies collected at the time, lists of conducted searches, sketches of the trail, and newspaper clippings. None of this information had led to a resolution back then. But now, with the backpack found, investigators wondered if something had been overlooked or misinterpreted. One detail that regained attention was the testimony of a guide named Arnaldo. Then 29 years old, he had claimed to have seen João Nunes standing at a point on the trail, looking down toward a secluded cluster of rocks. Arnaldo said that when he approached to offer help, João had simply nodded, as if in thanks, and continued on with his family. At the time, nothing seemed amiss, but in light of the 1998 discovery, the memory took on a new, ominous weight. What if that spot was the same place where the backpack was found? The hypothesis was tempting, but there was a problem. The position of the backpack between the rocks indicated it hadn't simply fallen there. It seemed wedged, almost hidden, as if someone had deliberately placed it. This raised another possibility. The items could have been brought to that spot sometime after the disappearance. But by whom, and for what reason? As the questions mounted, the remaining family in Bahia was contacted. Maria's sister, now an elderly woman, received the news with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She asked to see the backpack in person. When she did, she was overcome with emotion, recognizing the item at once. It had been a gift to João from a close friend, she explained. He always used it on short trips. She also recognized the stitching pattern and a small burn mark on the side caused, she said, by a spark from a wood-burning stove years earlier. Public interest was immense, but the investigation remained limited. Without biological evidence, it was impossible to confirm that the clothes and shoe belonged to the Nunes family, though all signs pointed to it. The location of the find was itself an enigma. Far from the trail in a hard-to-reach crevice, it would have required effort and knowledge of the terrain to get there. The guides who participated in the discovery recalled that as they removed the backpack, they had the impression that the surrounding area had been disturbed at some point. Newer branches were mixed with very old dry leaves, and some smaller stones appeared to have been displaced. This observation fueled theories that the spot might have served as a makeshift hiding place. By the end of 1998, the case was featured on television programs exploring unsolved mysteries. Interviews with old Rio residents and relatives in Bahia were broadcast, but no new concrete leads emerged. The police closed out the year with an inconclusive report. They had an object likely connected to the missing family found in an inaccessible location, but no direct evidence about the fate of the 4 people. What remained was a new layer to the mystery. Now, in addition to the original question, how did an entire family vanish on a busy trail? There was another, equally unsettling one. Who put the backpack in that place, and why? Beneath the constant gaze of Christ the Redeemer, The Corcovado Trail continued to welcome tourists every day, many of whom passed by, unaware that just a few meters away, history held a secret that had remained untouched for over half a century. The start of 1999 brought renewed efforts to revisit the mystery of the Nunes family. Although media attention had waned after the holidays, the team in charge of the case decided to retrace the entire Corcovado Trail, trying to understand how the backpack could have ended up in the crevice. This expedition was led by 2 investigators and accompanied by experienced guides, including a man named Moacir, who knew every curve and shortcut of the path. The group set out early while the sun was still low, the morning chill leaving the vegetation coated in dew. The sound of their footsteps on the stones was a soft echo, and the smell of damp earth mingled with the fragrance of wildflowers blooming in occasional clearings. As they followed the route, Moacir pointed to the spot where in 1947, the guide Arnaldo had reported seeing João Nunes looking down. It was a bend in the trail with a partial view of the city, but also with a steep slope that descended toward large rock formations. There was no marked path, but Moacir explained that for someone familiar with the area, it was possible to climb down carefully using roots and ledges for support. Not a place a tourist would go alone, but not impossible, he remarked. The group decided to attempt the descent. The incline demanded their full attention. Each step had to be firm, and in some sections, slippery moss made the rocks treacherous. After about 15 minutes, they reached a point where 2 large boulders formed a narrow corridor. It was there, wedged in a side gap, that the backpack had been found. Looking closely, it was clear that the spot received no direct sunlight, which explained the relative preservation of the objects. What was puzzling was that there were no clear signs that someone had fallen or slipped to that point. On the contrary, it seemed more likely that someone had arrived there in a controlled, deliberate manner. This realization strengthened the suspicion that the backpack might have been placed there not on the day of the disappearance, but at some later time. Moacir, who had seen many accidents and searches in the region, commented that if the family had fallen there, it was highly improbable that 4 people would have remained completely out of sight, and impossible that not a single body or piece of clothing would have been found over the years. The wild grows back, it covers a lot, he said, but it doesn't swallow everything. Back on the trail, the investigators tried to reconstruct possible scenarios. One hypothesis was that the family had strayed from the main path by mistake, perhaps drawn by a view or a shortcut suggested by someone. Another darker theory was that they might have been led off the trail against their will, but without any direct witnesses, every scenario remained pure speculation. In the archives, old notes indicated that in 1947, parts of the area were not as well defined for tourists. There was less signage, and the presence of unauthorized people was not uncommon. This left room for incidents, but also made it harder to track any suspicious activity. Meanwhile, the recovered items underwent further testing. A textile expert analyzed the backpack's fiber and confirmed it was cotton canvas with leather reinforcements, a common model in the 1940s, but rare to find in such good condition after so long. The stains on the shirt and the larger cloth remained inconclusive. The degradation was so severe that even advanced chemical tests could not confirm if they were blood. For Maria's sister, these technical doubts did not diminish her personal certainty. She was convinced the backpack belonged to her brother-in-law, and that the clothes were her family's. In an interview with a newspaper in Bahia, she said that while painful, the discovery brought a certain relief, because it proved they had indeed reached the Christ statue, contradicting old rumors that they might not have completed the climb. In Rio, the case once again became a topic of conversation among guides and residents near Corcovado. Some recalled old stories of lost tourists, especially before the trails were improved. Others mentioned that in the 1950s there were reports of objects found in hard-to-reach places, but they were never officially recorded because there was no clear connection to any known cases. What stood out most, however, was the coincidence of the backpack's location in relation to the spot where João had been seen standing. The distance between the 2 points was not great, and the descent to the site of the discovery required more courage than strength. To some, this suggested the backpack was hidden there on the very day of the disappearance. To others, it was a sign that someone had returned to the location years later, perhaps to dispose of something they never wanted found. The final report from this new inspection offered no definitive answers, but it solidified the area as a permanent point of interest in the investigation. The site was photographed and mapped in detail, and as a precaution, the park further restricted visitor access. The mystery, however, remained intact, and with it, the unsettling feeling that even after decades, something was hidden on that slope. Not necessarily an object, but a story that, for some reason, remained concealed. The rediscovery of the backpack also reignited the curiosity of a few investigative journalists who, in the 1990s, sought out old stories to retell in major magazines. One of them, Paulo Mendes, decided to dive into the case, convinced there were still gaps to be filled. His method was simple but laborious. Recover testimonies from people who lived or worked around Corcovado in 1947, compare the information, and cross-reference it with official records. Paulo began by interviewing veteran guides, some now retired. One of them, 78-year-old Otacílio, said that although he wasn't on duty the day of the disappearance, he remembered the sense of shock that swept through the tourist spot. It was a Sunday, it was busy, he recalled. Nobody expected an entire family to just vanish like that, right under everyone's noses. Otacílio also mentioned that, at the time, the searches were not as organized as they are today. There were no police cordons, and curious onlookers wandered the trail while teams searched for clues. One of Paulo's most interesting discoveries came from a private photo archive. He gained access to the images of Antonio Vieira, the street photographer who had captured the Nunes family. Among the photos on that roll were others taken on the same day, showing different tourists and points along the trail, all under the same overcast sky. In one of these photographs, taken just moments after the famous family portrait, João and Maria can be seen from behind, walking with their children. In the background, a stranger dressed in dark trousers and a long-sleeved shirt is partially obscured by foliage. There was no reason to believe he was significant, yet the presence of this previously unmentioned man opened a new line of speculation. Paulo attempted to identify the individual, but to no avail. None of the records or testimonies from that time made any reference to a companion or a suspicious figure. Still, he noted the detail and decided to cross-reference it with old maps of the park. The section of the trail where the photo was taken was relatively close to the observation point mentioned by the guide, Arnaldo, the same spot where João had supposedly stopped to look down. To Paulo, this could be a coincidence, but it could also be a potential link. Meanwhile, the forensic investigation continued to be a source of frustration. With no usable DNA, all that remained was a contextual analysis of the objects. The position of the backpack and the shoe suggested they had not ended up there by accident. The shoe, for example, showed no irregular wear that would suggest a violent fall, and its sole was almost pristine. This led some specialists to believe it had not been worn for the entire ascent, and may have been stored in the backpack, only to be taken out later at the hiding spot. While Paulo pursued his interviews in Bahia, Maria's sister gave an emotional statement to a local radio station. She said she had never believed the theory of a simple accident. My sister was careful and so was João. They weren't risk-takers. If they vanished, it's because someone crossed their path, she declared. Her words, broadcast across the state, reignited the discussion and prompted a flood of letters and phone calls from listeners sharing stories of their own relatives who had disappeared under strange circumstances during those years. However, none of these stories had any direct connection to Corcovado. The singularity of the Nunes case remained. 4 people together had vanished without a trace, and more than 50 years later, only a single backpack had resurfaced. Growing ever more involved, Paulo decided to visit the site of the discovery himself. He brought a camera and, accompanied by Moatsir, retraced the descent to the crevice between the rocks. Staring into the empty space, he tried to imagine the scene in 1947, the family walking, the backpack on João's shoulders, the point where he might have strayed from the group or peered down below. From that point on, any reconstruction was purely speculative. "What puzzles me," Moatsir remarked, "is how snugly the backpack was wedged in there. It doesn't seem like something that would happen by chance, does it?" Back in the city, Paulo compiled his findings and published a lengthy article. In its pages, he reconstructed the family's journey from Bahia, the last photograph on the trail, their disappearance, and the partial reappearance of their belongings in 1998. The piece, illustrated with the previously unpublished images, captured the public's attention and brought new context to the journalist. Among them was a former park employee who, in the 1950s, had heard rumors that tourists' belongings had been found by locals on the slopes but were never turned over to the authorities. This lead, though vague and unproven, reinforced the idea that objects could have been moved or hidden over the decades. By the end of that year, the formal investigation had once again gone cold, but Paulo's work kept the case alive in the press. His insistence on highlighting the geographical coincidence between João's last known position and the backpack's location became a central part of the narrative. And although no new physical evidence emerged, the pressure to prevent the case from being forgotten again was growing. What became increasingly clear to everyone involved was that the disappearance of the Nunes family was not just an old story. It was a fixed point in Corcovado's memory, an open wound on the landscape, a reminder that amid the beauty of the vista and the constant flow of tourists, there was an episode that time could not erase. In the early 2000s, the Nunes family case was thrust into the spotlight once more, featured on a national television program dedicated to unsolved mysteries. The production devoted an entire episode to the disappearance, blending interviews with archival footage and dramatic reenactments. To dramatize the ascent of Corcovado, they used extras dressed in period clothing, recreating the atmosphere of 1947. Men in hats, women in dresses, children in white socks, and even an actor carrying a replica of the brown canvas backpack. The episode began with the famous photograph of the family with the Christ the Redeemer statue in the background, enlarged to fill the screen before cutting to present-day footage of the trail, where tourists walked and took pictures. The narration described the overcast day, the family's calm demeanor, and the sudden absence that, more than half a century later, remained unexplained. The program then presented the discovery of the backpack in 1998, with close-ups of the original photos taken at the scene, the crevice between the rocks, the shoe, the stained fabric. The reporting team interviewed Moatsir, who repeated his account of the descent to the discovery site. His words reinforced what was already known. The backpack didn't fall there. It was placed. This statement, broadcast nationwide, unleashed a new wave of speculation. Online forums and newspaper columns began to question whether someone might have hidden the object to conceal something far more sinister. The program's impact led a viewer from Minas Gerais to contact the producers. He claimed to be the nephew of a tourist who had been in Rio in June 1947 and, according to family stories, remembered seeing a couple with two children talking to a lone man near a viewpoint. There were not enough details to confirm it was the Nunes family, but the coincidence of the date and location was striking. The information was passed on to the authorities who, lacking any new evidence, simply logged it as a supplementary note. Meanwhile, in Bahia, Maria's sister watched the episode on television and once again confirmed her certainty about the backpack's identity. In every new interview, she repeated that the burn mark on its side was unmistakable. For her, the discovery was both a proof and a burden. "It's like seeing a piece of them," she said, "but never being able to know what happened." In parallel, oral history researchers began recording testimonies from longtime residents of the area surrounding Corcovado. Among these accounts, a mention emerged of a small group of youths who, in the 1940s, used to explore areas off the official trail to hunt birds or simply seek adventure. One of the interviewees, now in his 80s, claimed to have heard back then about a hole between the rocks where a large object was being stored. He couldn't remember the exact location, but his description sounded remarkably similar to the spot where the backpack was found. This coincidence fueled the theory that the backpack might have been moved in the years immediately following the disappearance and had remained hidden ever since. The absence of the family's other personal belongings, such as the camera they likely used or the children's small possessions, remained inexplicable. If they had fallen or gotten lost, why would only the backpack have survived? The TV program also interviewed physical geography experts who explained how the combination of humidity, shade, and a sheltered position could preserve an object for decades without complete decomposition. This helped explain the relatively good condition of the shoe and the canvas, but it did not answer the main question: who put it there? With the national exposure, the park saw a temporary increase in curious visitors, some hoping to see the site where the backpack was found. For safety and preservation reasons, the administration kept the area restricted, but public interest ensured the story became an unofficial part of the narrative shared by tour guides. Some emphasized the mystery while others preferred to omit it, not wanting to turn the trail into a site for morbid tourism. Paulo Mendes, the journalist who had been following the case for years, saw the program as an opportunity to resume his investigation. He revisited his files, compared photographs, and noticed a detail that had previously escaped him. In the 1947 image where João is seen looking down, his body position suggests he was just a few meters from the start of the descent into the crevice. This visual alignment strengthened the possibility of a direct connection between that moment and the location of the discovery. Still, without new physical evidence, the case remained open. Time, relentless, worked against any chance of a definitive answer. All that was left was the persistence of those who believed that, even after so many decades, there was something more to be discovered on the slopes of Corcovado. The early 2010s brought a new element to the case, not through direct police action, but through the initiative of history and archival enthusiasts. A group of volunteers in Rio de Janeiro, specializing in digitizing old photographs, began working on private collections from families who had visited Corcovado throughout the 20th century. Their goal was to create a public online archive of historical images of the monument and its trails, allowing anyone to contribute photos and information. Among the hundreds of images submitted, one sequence taken by an Argentine tourist in June 1947 during a visit to Christ the Redeemer stood out. The photos showed the stone path, the viewpoint, and various points along the trail. In one of them, blurry and taken from a distance, a group of 4 people appeared: a man with a backpack, a woman and two children. It was impossible to confirm immediately that they were João, Maria, Lúcia and Pedro, but the resemblance to the famous family photograph was strong. The image was submitted for expert analysis, which compared clothing patterns and the shape of the backpack. The result indicated a strong compatibility, though it fell short of definitive proof. This finding reignited discussions. The Argentine photograph showed the group on a higher section of the trail, just a few minutes before the viewpoint where João was reportedly seen looking down. This reinforced the timeline constructed by Paulo Mendes and other researchers. The family had made it near the top, but had not completed their return journey. Concurrently, a more recent geographical survey of the park revealed that in the 1940s, some areas that are now blocked off were accessible via small shortcuts used by local guides and residents. These paths, often steep and dangerous, connected the main trail to little-known observation points. The crevice where the backpack was found was located near one of these old shortcuts. This information added a new layer to the investigation. Perhaps the family had followed one of these paths, willingly or not, and vanished from the main flow of visitors. Mosir, who still worked as a guide for special tours, was invited to comment on this detail for an independent documentary. He confirmed that he had known about the shortcut since he was young, but had always considered it too risky for inexperienced hikers. "It's narrow," he said, "and the rock is too smooth in some spots. Anyone using it would need to be very confident or accompanied by someone who knew the way." Meanwhile, in Bahia, the story circulated once again on local radio and in newspapers, with older residents recalling the impact of the disappearance in 1947. A childhood neighbor of Maria's recounted that before the trip, her friend had mentioned how excited she was to see Rio from above and that she planned to keep the photos as mementos to show her children when they grew up. For her, it was painful to think that the family's most famous image had become the marker of their absence. The volunteer group that discovered the Argentine photo also scoured newspapers from the era and found a small note published in a Rio daily on June 17, 1947. The text read, "The search continues on Corcovado for the fourth consecutive day without results. Witnesses report seeing the Nunes family at different points along the trail, but there is no consensus on the exact time." This discrepancy in timing, though common in cases with multiple testimonies, raised doubts about the accuracy of the accounts. Informed of the new photograph, Paulo Mendes traveled to Buenos Aires to try to locate the descendants of the Argentine tourist. He discovered that the man had passed away in the 1980s but had left behind albums and letters. Among them was a brief note in Spanish mentioning La familia brasileña que desapareció, the Brazilian family that disappeared, and stating that the author only learned of their vanishing days later, once he was back in his own country. This small record confirmed that the story had crossed borders at the time, even without significant international attention. The possibility of cross-referencing this information with the location of the backpack seemed promising, but once again, it hit the wall of no material evidence. The area where the crevice was located had undergone minor natural and maintenance-related changes over the years, making any in-depth soil examination difficult. Nevertheless, the coordinates were preserved and the site remained under observation. Behind the scenes, some retired investigators commented that if the backpack had been found just a few years after the disappearance, there might have been a better chance of locating other belongings or even human remains. But the 51-year gap between the disappearance and the discovery was an almost insurmountable barrier to definitive answers. Even so, the digital archive with the Argentine photo and other records helped keep the story alive for new generations. Young people who had never heard of the Nunes family began to learn about the case and, in some instances to visit Corcovado with a different perspective, not just for the beauty of the landscape, but also for the mystery it concealed. What became evident to historians and curious onlookers alike was that each new fragment, be it a forgotten photo, a belated testimony, or an old map, did not solve the mystery but rather expanded the field of questions. And there, among the stones of Corcovado, those questions seemed to resist the passage of time as steadfastly as the Christ statue itself. With the circulation of the Argentine photograph and the surge in public interest, a few independent researchers decided to form a small study group dedicated exclusively to the Nunes family case. They began meeting monthly in a room borrowed from a community library in Rio de Janeiro. The objective was to gather all possible material, photos, maps, newspaper clippings, and testimonies, to create a visual and geographical timeline of the disappearance. Among the members was André Sampaio, a geographer specializing in historical cartography. André dedicated weeks to comparing maps of Tijuca National Park from the 1940s and 1950s with current satellite images. His work revealed fascinating details. Stretches of the trail that were more exposed to the sun in 1947 had, over the decades, been overtaken by dense vegetation, altering the perception of distance and visibility. More importantly, he identified at least 3 old secondary paths that, at the time, connected the main trail to areas now closed to the public, including one that passed very near the crevice where the backpack was found. This discovery reinforced the theory that the family might have strayed from the official route, either voluntarily or led by someone. On an enlarged map, André demonstrated how it was possible to leave the main trail at a point near the lookout and, in less than 10 minutes of descent, reach the crevice. It wasn't a route for just any tourist, he explained during one of the group's meetings, but it wasn't impossible for someone who was determined. Meanwhile, Paulo Mendes remained active, but with a different focus. He began interviewing the descendants of people who had worked on the maintenance of Corcovado in the 1940s. One of these conversations yielded a curious account. The grandson of a former employee said his grandfather would occasionally mention a place down there that no one should ever disturb because it brought bad luck. Although Paulo avoided any mystical interpretation, he recorded the information as a possible indication that certain spots in the park were deliberately avoided or viewed with suspicion. The study group also contacted the National Institute of Meteorology to obtain weather records for June 1947. They discovered that the 15th had been marked by intermittent fog, with the greatest intensity late in the morning, exactly the period when the family was last seen. This information, cross-referenced with witness accounts, helped explain how a group could vanish from sight in a matter of minutes without necessarily being far away. In Bahia, Maria's sister continued to be one of the most active voices in preserving the memory of the case. Now quite elderly, she began recording her testimony for broadcasters and researchers documenting the story. In one of these recordings, she shared something never before mentioned. Maria had a fear of heights and tended to avoid highly exposed places. To some, this reinforced the idea that she would not have voluntarily left the trail for dangerous shortcuts, unless there was a very compelling reason or external pressure. The study group also managed to digitize the famous photograph of the family, taken by Antonio Vieira in high resolution. The enlargement revealed previously unnoticed details. On the side of the image, almost out of frame, was a shadow that could have been a person or merely a projected branch. While it proved nothing, it served as a reminder that every piece of information could hold hidden clues. As the research progressed, the desire to conduct a new expedition to the exact location of the crevice grew. The idea was not only to revisit the site but also to explore the surrounding area for any trace that might have been overlooked in 1998. A mixed team was assembled, including members of the group, experienced guides, and limited logistical support from the park. Their goal was to document everything with photographs, videos, and detailed notes. The descent was made on a clear day, but even so, the humidity was palpable with every step. The smell of decomposing leaves was strong, and small drops of water trickled down the moss-covered rocks. When they reached the crevice, they noticed that although the spot was empty, there were subtle changes in the soil and the arrangement of smaller stones. No one could say whether this was the result of natural processes or recent human interference. Andre Sampaio used equipment to measure the depth of some nearby cavities. He discovered that one of them, just above the crevice, had enough space to store larger objects. This finding led to a new theory. Perhaps the backpack found in 1998 had been moved from a deeper point to the visible location, either by erosion or by a person. This would explain why it was partially buried yet still accessible. Although they found no new objects, the expedition served to precisely document the scene and reinforce the geographical complexity of the area. The crevice was not visible from the main trail and required specific knowledge to be located. This kept alive the question that had spanned generations. How and why had the Nunes family ended up so close to it? At the end of that day, as the group made their way back up the trail, the distant sound of the cable car ascending and descending mingled with the songs of birds and the rustling of leaves. For some, it was impossible not to imagine the scene from 1947. João with the backpack on his shoulder, Maria making sure the children didn't run ahead, and that single fleeting moment when their path diverged forever from the visible world. The year 2015 marked a special moment for the researchers and enthusiasts of the Nunes case. It had been 68 years since the family's disappearance. Although there were no official updates, the study group that had formed a few years earlier decided to organize a public seminar in Rio de Janeiro, bringing together investigators, historians, and experienced Corcovado guides. The event took place in a simple but packed auditorium. Near the entrance, a table displayed replicas of the brown canvas backpack and the shoe, crafted from original measurements and photographs. Panels showed a timeline of the case, old park maps, and enlargements of the most well-known images. Among those present were young people interested in history, older residents who vaguely remembered the disappearance, and a few foreign tourists who had read about the case on blogs and online forums. The first presentation was by Paulo Mendes, who opened by speaking about the importance of preserving archives and testimonies. He presented unpublished excerpts from interviews with the descendants of the photographer Antonio Vieira, and highlighted the photographic sequence discovered in Argentina, showing how these images helped solidify the timeline of June 15, 1947. Next, Andre Sampaio displayed overlays of old and current maps, reinforcing the existence of the secondary paths that could explain how the family might have reached the area of the crevice. One of the most emotional moments occurred when a great-niece of João Nunes, who had never known her great-uncle, took the stage to speak. She recounted that in her family the subject had always been treated with respect and bujnos, but rarely with detail. I grew up hearing they had disappeared in the river, but only now do I understand the full scope of the story, she said, her voice trembling. During the break, conversation circles formed where hypotheses were freely discussed. Some believed it was an accident, others a crime, but everyone agreed that the reappearance of the backpack half a century later was the most intriguing point. A former guide who had worked on Corcovado in the 1970s mentioned in an informal chat that he had heard from colleagues about old objects being found on the slopes, but since lost backpacks and belongings were common, such finds were rarely officially recorded. In the afternoon, the seminar continued with a roundtable on modern search and rescue techniques. Experts explained that even today, with drones and advanced mapping, areas like Corcovado still contain stretches that are inaccessible or too dangerous to explore. The irregular geography, combined with dense vegetation and constant humidity, creates an environment where objects and even bodies can remain hidden for decades. This made many wonder how many other secrets might be kept there. At the closing, a proposal was put forward to attempt, with the park's authorization, a controlled sweep of the crevice area using ground-penetrating radar. The goal would be to identify possible cavities or buried objects without the need for invasive excavation. Although the idea was well received, bureaucracy and high costs made its short-term execution difficult. After the event, the local press reported on the initiative and interviewed some participants. The article highlighted how, even without a solution, the Nunes family case continued to mobilize people and inspire independent investigations. One reporter ended his story with a sentence that stuck in many people's minds. Between the stone and the fog, the story still waits. Meanwhile, Maria's sister, now over 90 years old, sent a letter to Paulo Mendes thanking him for his efforts to keep the story alive. She wrote in a shaky hand that she knew she would not see the mystery solved, but she felt comforted knowing that others would continue to seek answers. In the following months, the study group continued its meetings. Andre worked on updating the three-dimensional map of the area, incorporating data collected during the previous expeditions. The result was a digital model that accurately showed the topography and the location of the crevice, allowing for simulations of possible access routes. Paulo, for his part, began writing a book, compiling all the material he had collected over nearly 2 decades of research. He wanted the account to be not just a historical record, but also an invitation for new investigators to take an interest in the case. In the opening chapter, he described the scene of the family posing for the 1947 photograph in rich detail, highlighting the contrast between that serene moment and the uncertain fate that followed. By the end of that year, there were no concrete discoveries, but there was something that everyone considered a victory. The case had not been forgotten. The memory of João, Maria, Lúcia and Pedro remained alive, sustained by photographs, accounts, and the persistence of those who refused to accept silence as a final answer. The years following the 2015 seminar were marked by a constant effort to turn public interest into concrete investigative action. The proposal to use ground-penetrating radar in the crevice area was kept alive, but faced bureaucratic and financial barriers. Meanwhile, the study group members continued to explore other avenues, hoping to uncover any new clue that might bring clarity to the mystery. Paulo Mendes was making progress on his book, and to make it as complete as possible, he decided to conduct a final round of interviews, including not only people directly connected to the case but also experts in historical disappearances. Among these interviewees was a forensic archaeologist who had worked in dense forest areas. He explained that in environments like Corcovado, the preservation of human remains and objects is extremely variable. In some spots, the acidity of the soil accelerates decomposition. In others, protected cavities can preserve traces for decades. Meanwhile, Andre Sampaio was refining the three-dimensional model of the slope, adding historical climate data. In collaboration with meteorologists, he simulated the visibility on the trail under different fog conditions like those recorded on June 15, 1947. The result was striking. Even from just a few meters away, a person could vanish from sight in less than a minute if they stepped off the side of the trail during a period of dense. This data reinforced the possibility that the family had left the main path without being noticed. At the same time, new testimonies emerged unexpectedly. A resident of the Cosme Velho neighborhood who was only 12 at the time said she had seen unusual activity the day after the disappearance. She recalled men climbing the slope with ropes and lanterns, but didn't remember seeing any women or children. The memory, though vague, was recorded and compared to official reports, but there was no specific mention of such an operation on the second day of the search. In 2018, Paulo gained access to a batch of aerial photographs taken by the Brazilian army in the late 1940s for city mapping. Although the resolution was limited, he identified a small clearing near the crevice, visible at the time but now covered by vegetation. This discovery led to the hypothesis that in the past, access to that point might have been easier, facilitating both the family's arrival and the subsequent concealment of the backpack. The persistence of the study group also caught the attention of foreign documentary filmmakers. A crew from a European channel specializing in unresolved stories came to Brazil to film an episode about the case. The production included reenactments of the family's ascent and interviews with the main figures in the contemporary investigation. By showing images of the site where the backpack was found, the documentary reinforced the idea that the spot was strategic for someone wanting to hide something without being seen from the main trail. The international attention brought new perspectives but no answers. Still, it generated a small logistical miracle. An applied archaeology NGO offered to finance part of the ground-penetrating radar work. In 2019, after months of paperwork, authorization was granted for a pilot study. The day of the operation was tense. Equipment was positioned in the crevice and its immediate surroundings. The device was moved slowly across the surface, emitting signals that passed through the layer of soil and surface rock. The resulting images showed anomalies in at least two spots: a cavity about a meter deep and an irregularly shaped metallic object buried closer to the surface. For reasons of environmental preservation and safety, immediate excavation was not authorized. The data was cataloged for future analysis, but the pandemic, which would begin just a few months later, brought all progress to a halt. The postponement frustrated everyone. Paulo, now in the final stages of his book, decided to include the radar episode as the closing chapter, making it clear that even with the most modern technology, the case remained without a definitive conclusion. For him, this was the essence of the story. An incomplete puzzle in which each new piece found only enlarged the void. In late 2021, with health restrictions still in place, the group met virtually to discuss the next steps. There was a consensus that the work had to continue, but also a keen awareness that time is unforgiving. Witnesses grow old, memories shift and fade, and the natural environment is in a constant state of flux. Still, everyone agreed the effort was worthwhile, not just for the remote possibility of solving the mystery, but to preserve the memory of the Nunes family as part of the city's history. Meanwhile, the fissure point remained, silent, shrouded in shadow and dampness. Every day, tourists passed just a few meters away, never imagining that behind that green curtain of leaves and moss lay the epicenter of one of the most intriguing disappearances in Brazilian history. When it was finally possible to resume field activities in early 2023, the team investigating the Nunes family case received authorization for a more in-depth investigation of the fissure area. Anticipation was high, but it was tempered with caution. More than 7 decades had passed since the disappearance, and any clues that might still exist would be extremely degraded. The work began early, on a rare, dry, and sunny day for that hillside, where humidity usually prevails. The ground-penetrating radar equipment, first used in 2019, was brought back to re-examine the anomalies detected previously. With the coordinates already mapped, the team marked out 2 points for a controlled excavation, adhering to all environmental protocols. At the first point, where the radar had indicated a cavity about a meter deep, the excavation revealed only a natural space formed between rocks, filled with decomposing leaves and roots. There were no human remains or recognizable objects. At the second point, closer to the surface, they found corroded metal fragments, possibly parts of an old buckle or clasp. Preliminary analysis indicated that the material could be consistent with backpack parts from the 1940s, but there was no way to prove a direct link to the object found in 1998. Despite the frustration of not making any conclusive discoveries, the fieldwork had a positive outcome. It allowed for a precise documentation of the area's geographical and environmental conditions, which will be invaluable for future investigations. Andre Sampaio updated his three-dimensional model with this new data, creating the most complete version of the terrain ever made. In parallel, Paulo Mendes finalized and published his book titled Between the Stones and the Mist, The Mystery of the Nunes Family. The work brought together photographs, maps, testimonies, and analyses presenting the story in a chronological and contextualized manner. At the book launch, held at a cultural center in Rio, Paulo declared that his greatest hope was that, at some point, new information would surface, even if by chance. What happened to João, Maria, Lúcia, and Pedro is part of our country's history, he said. We cannot let it be erased. The book gained modest but significant attention, attracting readers from different parts of Brazil. Some sent messages recounting memories from relatives who lived in Rio in the 1940s, though none of these recollections provided concrete data for the investigation. Still, they served to reinforce the idea that the disappearance had marked the city in subtle ways, lingering like a quiet ghost in the cultural landscape. At the end of 2023, the study group held one last in-person meeting before the year's end. They reviewed all the results obtained since the group's formation, the precise location of the fissure, the discovery of unpublished photographs, the detailed geographical analysis, the use of radar, and the preservation of the family's memory. Although none of them could claim to have gotten closer to the absolute truth, they all agreed that the case would never again fall into complete oblivion. Maria's sister, who passed away in mid-2022, did not live to see these final stages of the investigation, but she left a message recorded on video. Even without knowing what happened, she said, I want the world to remember them as good people who came to see Rio with joy in their hearts. Her testimony was played at the meeting, moving everyone present. Today, the fissure point remains off-limits to ordinary tourists. Only authorized guides and researchers are allowed to approach. Those who walk the main trail see nothing but dense vegetation. But for those who know the story, every stone, every curve, and every shadow carries the weight of an unsolved enigma. And so, the mystery of the Nunes family continues, suspended between the stone and the mist, with the brown canvas backpack as its most enduring symbol. It is a case that, even without a definitive answer, has become a powerful reminder that some events withstand the passage of time not just for the lack of evidence, but for the profound impact they leave on people and places. If one day the truth comes to light, it may be through a chance discovery, just as it was in 1998. Until then, there is only the trail, the silence, and the memory of 4 people who ascended Corcovado to see Christ the Redeemer, and were never seen again. If this story captured your attention, subscribe to the channel now to follow other investigations like this one. Share this video with someone you think needs to know the case of the Nunes family. And if you want to continue diving into real Brazilian mysteries, click here to watch the recommended videos appearing on your screen.